The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim moon that cast its light upon the stone walls of Istanbul, the empire breathed like a living beast, ancient, relentless, and heavy with the scent of iron and incense. In those years, the Ottoman dominion stretched across 3 continents, binding kingdoms with fear and gold. Its pulse echoed through mosques, battlefields, and palaces, each heartbeat fueled by conquest. To the chroniclers of the time, it was divine order manifest, the will of heaven expressed through the Sultan's sword. Yet beneath the gold leaf and calligraphy of the imperial archives lay darker pages, records that spoke not of glory, but of the spoils of victory, the price of power, and the fate of those who stood in its path. In the stillness of midnight, scribes in the imperial chancery recorded every battle, every oath of allegiance, every captive taken in war. Their quills scratched the parchment with the precision of executioners. Among those cold entries were lists, names of villages burned, numbers of prisoners enslaved, and, almost as an afterthought, the tally of women distributed to the victors. The words were clean, bureaucratic, devoid of emotion. But behind each entry was a human story, one that began in smoke and ended in silence. The Ottoman army, the Janissaries, were unlike any other force Europe had seen. They were trained from childhood, stripped of family and faith, reshaped into instruments of the state. To them, mercy was disobedience, compassion, a fracture in the chain of command. When they marched into the Balkans or the Aegean, the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath their step. Yet conquest was only the beginning. What followed was the harvest, a process more chilling than the battle itself. In the field reports sent to the Sublime Porte, officers described with unsettling precision the division of spoils. The dead were counted first, then the weapons, livestock, and coin. Finally came the human yields, men for slavery or ransom, and women for redistribution. It was a system as old as war itself, sanctified by law and ritual. The chroniclers did not use the word rape. They used possession, gift, or assignment. The meaning was the same, but the language allowed the empire to remain unblemished, its sins wrapped in ceremony. In one surviving record, dated from the late 15th century, a note describes the wives of the enemy warriors taken to the capital for proper allocation. It is written in the same hand that recorded grain shipments and tax revenues. To read it is to feel the weight of normalization, the casual erasure of suffering. The scribe's hand never trembled. He was doing his duty. The empire's bureaucracy was as merciless as its army. Behind these records, historians later found hints of something more deliberate. The taking of the enemy's wives was not merely a custom, it was a weapon. It fractured lineages, extinguished vengeance, and turned honor into humiliation. A warrior who survived defeat knew that his death was not the end of his dishonor. His family would bear it for generations. Among the Greeks, Serbs, and Armenians, whispers grew into legends that the Ottoman conquest did not just destroy kingdoms, it consumed souls. Within the empire, this practice was veiled in theology and legality. The clerics issued decrees that sanctified it, calling it the natural consequence of victory. Captive women were classified as property under the state's law of spoils. They could be sold, traded, or gifted. Some were taken into the Sultan's palace, their beauty recorded like inventory, their origins erased. Others were sent to the provinces, given to governors or generals as tokens of favor. The empire had turned human lives into currency. In the coastal regions of Greece and the highlands of Bosnia, travelers described towns where only the old and the very young remained. The rest had been taken, men to the galleys, women to the harems. In the letters of Venetian merchants, one finds uneasy observations of markets where captives were displayed like jewels. The price of a woman rose with her lineage, her youth, or the color of her eyes. Sometimes the merchants recorded faint details. She wept quietly, or she refused to speak. The notations read like confessions, though the traders themselves were complicit in the commerce of despair. In the capital, the newly captured women entered a labyrinth of corridors, overseen by black eunuchs, who enforced silence with unwavering obedience. Their world was ruled by routine. Baths, prayers, lessons in etiquette, and the endless wait for a command. They were given new names, new clothes, and new languages. The transformation was not just physical. It was spiritual annihilation. The empire did not need to kill its enemies. It remade them. Yet, even within this machinery of control, there were cracks through which whispers escaped. Servants spoke of women who tried to flee, who leapt from balconies into the Bosporus, preferring the river's cold mercy to the Sultan's gaze. Others faded into obedience, their rebellion turned inward, surviving only in secret songs. These songs, if they existed, were never written down, but their echoes appear in folklore centuries later, in tales of spectral women wandering palace corridors, veiled in sorrow, searching for names that history had erased. The state chroniclers avoided such stories. To them, the empire was infallible, ordained. But foreign envoys and captive priests left behind fragments of testimony, accounts that blend horror and disbelief. Some described how, during campaigns in Hungary, women were paraded before the victors as proof of dominance. Others told of entire families marched in chains across the Balkans, the wives separated from their husbands by decree. One chronicler wrote, "The Sultan conquers not only the body, but the soul of a people." It is difficult, centuries later, to separate fact from exaggeration. Some scholars argue that these tales were embellished by enemies of the empire, meant to vilify what they could not defeat militarily. Others point to the legal documents, the decrees of property transfer, and the household ledgers of provincial governors, as evidence that such practices were systematic. Between these two versions of history lies a shadowed truth, neither myth nor certainty, but something in between, where morality dissolves into necessity. What is undeniable is the silence that followed. For the women taken, no memoirs remain, no diaries, no letters. Their stories survive only through the lens of those who owned or pitied them. In that silence, historians find the outline of an empire's cruelty, precise, procedural, and indifferent. The Ottomans did not need to scream to assert power. They whispered, and entire nations obeyed. At the heart of this machinery stood the idea of divine destiny. The Sultan's expansion was portrayed as a continuation of faith, a fulfillment of prophecy. To resist was to defy God himself, and so each act of conquest carried the weight of righteousness. Every ruined village, every captive woman, became a sign of divine favor. The empire's architects built their glory on this paradox, that holiness could coexist with horror, that civilization could be advanced through subjugation. When dawn came over the domes of Istanbul, the city glimmered with splendor. The call to prayer, the scent of bread, the sound of merchants opening their stalls. To the casual eye, it was paradise. But behind the marble facades and tiled courtyards were the hidden chambers, where the empire's victims lived out their days. Their silence was the mortar that held the empire's beauty together. To open the archives today is to confront a truth that the scribes never intended us to read emotionally. The ink has faded, but the cruelty remains intact. Each decree, each signature, is a fingerprint of power exercised without restraint. And in the margins, barely legible, are notes that hint at discomfort, perhaps even guilt. One scribe wrote simply, "They did not cry out." Whether he meant it as a record or a prayer, no one can say. Thus begins the story of the empire's most horrific practice, not as a spectacle of violence, but as an anatomy of silence. It is not the sword that defines its darkness, but the bureaucracy that made suffering legal, efficient, and invisible. The Ottomans' greatness was measured in monuments, their shadow in the number of lives unrecorded. And somewhere within that vast silence, the faint echo of those women endures, unseen, unnamed, but not forgotten. The chronicles of conquest seldom paused to describe the days that followed victory. When a city fell, the record moved quickly to tribute, titles, treaties, never to the faces left in the dust. Yet the days after battle were the empire's true workshop of terror. The Ottomans, heirs to centuries of imperial method, understood that fear was the most durable form of rule. They crafted it not from steel, but from the quiet order of what came next. The soldiers called it the sorting. When the smoke of battle lifted, officers erected wooden tables among the ruins, laid out ledgers, and began to count. Bodies were cleared first, enemy dead to the pyres, fallen Ottomans to the graves of honor. Then the living were divided, men of fighting age bound together with rope, elders separated for interrogation, children and women herded behind the wagons. The system was so disciplined that foreign envoys sometimes mistook it for mercy. It was nothing of the kind. It was administration masquerading as order. To the survivors, the sound of ink and quill was more terrible than the clash of swords. Each stroke fixed a fate. Those marked with the red symbol were to be transported to the slave markets of Bursa or Edirne. Those with the black were condemned to forced labor. But there was a third mark, an ornate seal pressed beside the names of women deemed notable. That mark meant disappearance. Within a day they would vanish into the convoys bound for Istanbul, where even their language would be taken from them. Contemporary witnesses spoke of the silence that fell over these processions. No weeping, no cries, only the shuffling of feet on broken stone. Some say the women were too shocked to speak, others that soldiers struck those who made a sound. Either way, the silence became ritual. It was as if the empire demanded not only submission but complicity, forcing its captives to act out the serenity of the conquered. In later years, poets of the Balkans would describe this silence as the tax of the living, a payment extracted from those who still breathed. The journey to the capital could last weeks. Caravans wound through ravaged villages where smoke still rose from the roofs. At each stop, inspectors noted numbers, ages, and conditions, just as they did with livestock. Scribes annotated their pages with remarks: suitable, injured, faint of spirit. There was no malice in the handwriting, only efficiency. The empire's genius lay in its ability to turn cruelty into routine. Some captives never reached the city. The road itself consumed them. Disease, hunger, exhaustion. When they collapsed, the soldiers dragged the bodies aside, left them beneath olive trees, and continued marching. A handful of letters from provincial commanders mention these deaths in passing. Losses along the route, insignificant to the total. Those 4 words, insignificant to the total, may be the truest summary of empire ever written. For those who survived, the gates of Istanbul were not an end but a threshold. Beyond them lay the markets of Tahtakale, where traders from across the Mediterranean haggled over carpets, spices, and human beings. The captives were taken to private courtyards, bathed, clothed in plain linen, and displayed for inspection. The buyers were not only merchants but officials, palace functionaries, and members of the military elite seeking gifts for their patrons. The language of the market was carefully sanitized. The word for sale was presentation. The word for buyer, recipient of favor. Even at its most grotesque, the empire spoke the grammar of ceremony. Accounts from that period suggest that the division of captives followed unwritten hierarchies. Women of noble origin or exceptional beauty were set apart, reserved for the palace. The rest were distributed among the victors, often as part of their pay. It was a practice justified by theology, rationalized by law, and perpetuated by desire. The empire's jurists wrote long treatises defending it as the rightful spoil of jihad. Their arguments, dense with scripture, masked a simpler truth. Power craves witnesses to its triumph. To possess the wife of a defeated warrior was to hold proof of dominion, not only over a man, but over his memory. In villages across the conquered lands, this new order reshaped daily life. Where once family names carried pride, they now carried danger. Mothers hid their daughters in cellars, disguised them as servants, or cut their hair to appear as boys. Priests and imams alike recorded baptisms and conversions in secret, hoping that faith, any faith, might offer protection. But the Ottoman system was not built on faith. It was built on procedure. A sealed document from a provincial office was more powerful than any prayer. Within the empire's cities, meanwhile, a quieter transformation took place. Captured women who entered Ottoman households became instruments of assimilation. They learned the language, adopted new names, and bore children who would never know the lands their mothers came from. The state encouraged this blending. It diluted rebellion, turned victims into citizens. To later historians, this mixture produced the cosmopolitan face of the empire. To the women themselves, it was erasure dressed as civilization. Among the janissaries, those iron men of the Sultan, stories circulated about the spoils of great battles, the jewels seized, the estates granted, the women gifted. To them it was a sign of divine reward. They did not question the morality of it. They had been trained not to. From childhood, they were told that mercy belonged to God alone. Their duty was obedience. In time, they believed it. The soldiers, who once had been Christian boys, taken through the Devshirme system, now enforced upon others the same bondage they had endured. The cycle was perfect, self-replicating, without conscience. Not all within the empire were blind to the horror. Fragments of poetry, written by anonymous hands, speak of remorse. A verse found in the margin of an accounting book reads, "We conquer, and the stars dim. We pray, and the wind weeps." Such lines suggest that somewhere inside the machinery of conquest, human sorrow still flickered. But sorrow had no place in law. The empire survived precisely because it could absorb private guilt without ever altering public policy. Foreign chroniclers who visited Istanbul described its contradictions with awe and unease. They saw minarets rising like lances beside bustling markets, scholars debating philosophy under arcades, and yet, behind guarded doors, they sensed another world, a labyrinth of chambers where foreign tongues whispered prayers no one answered. Some of these observers left sketches, women behind latticed windows, their faces indistinct, their presence implied more by shadow than by form. To later generations, these images would become symbols of Oriental mystery. But at the time, they were something simpler, evidence that beauty can be a prison. As months turned into years, many of the captives disappeared into the empire's immense anonymity. A few rose in rank, wielding influence through charm or intelligence. One or two even bore sons who would become governors or generals, unknowingly perpetuating the same system that had enslaved their mothers. Such ironies were common in imperial history, where suffering and privilege often shared the same roof. The empire did not erase its victims by killing them. It absorbed them, digested them, and called the process civilization. For the conquered provinces, the memory of these events hardened into folklore. Ballads were sung in secret about warriors who returned from exile to find their wives in the harems of foreign lords, about mothers who walked into rivers rather than live in captivity. The Ottomans dismissed such tales as enemy propaganda, yet they spread like seeds on the wind, ensuring that even in defeat, resistance survived in song. Centuries later, those same stories would feed the fires of nationalism that eventually tore the empire apart. History, indifferent though it may seem, never forgets humiliation. The empire's administrators understood this. To maintain control, they crafted rituals of amnesia. Children born of captives were registered without mention of lineage. Their mothers' origins were struck from the rolls. Official histories spoke only of glorious battles and benevolent sultans. The bureaucrats who wrote them were not liars. They were craftsmen of omission. They knew that the survival of empire depended on what was not said. Still, there were traces that refused to fade. Letters smuggled from monasteries, court petitions from provincial widows. Even travelers' songs carried fragments of the forbidden truth. They described nights when the sea breeze brought faint cries from the slave ships anchored below the palace walls, or mornings when the streets smelled of incense masking decay. Such images linger because they reveal what statistics cannot: the slow corrosion of conscience. In later centuries, when reformers tried to modernize the empire, they found themselves haunted by these ghosts. They spoke of liberty, of equality before the law, but the foundation upon which they stood was soaked with unacknowledged suffering. Empires rarely fall from defeat alone. They collapse when their own myths become unbearable. The Ottoman myth, that conquest was sacred, that the taking of captives was divine justice, could not survive the age of reason. But before it faded, it left scars deep enough to shape generations. Even now, when historians open the yellowed ledgers of that era, they find the same cold script repeating across the pages. One village taken, 300 men, 200 women, 40 sent to the capital. Nothing more. No names, no cries, no details of what became of them. And yet, in those absences, the story speaks louder than any chronicle. It tells of a civilization brilliant and brutal, capable of composing poetry and atrocity with the same hand. The battle may have ended, but the accounting never did. Thus the empire advanced, city by city, life by life, until the map itself seemed to bow beneath its weight. From the Adriatic to the deserts of Arabia, its banners rose over ruins still warm with the breath of the conquered. The soldiers marched on, singing hymns of victory, believing themselves chosen by destiny. Behind them, the roads filled with the voiceless procession of women, the true witnesses of empire. Their footsteps, though unheard, marked the boundary between glory and guilt. And as the sun set over the domes of Istanbul, the scribes lit their lamps and resumed their work, recording another triumph. The ink glistened, the parchment curled, and the empire, satisfied, slept. But beneath its sleep, the silence of the taken stirred, an unending murmur, soft as dust, reminding the living that every conquest carries within it the seed of its own judgment. Night settles differently over conquered ground. Long after the soldiers march away, the air itself seems altered, heavy, listening. In the Balkans, in the plains of Hungary, in the high valleys of Greece, the silence that followed Ottoman victory was not peace, but paralysis. Villages once bright with the rhythm of bells and market songs became places of whispering. The empire called it order. The survivors knew it as mourning. From the distant capital, imperial edicts arrived, promising protection for those who submitted, tax relief for those who rebuilt. But these proclamations, written in elegant calligraphy, fluttered like illusions against the smell of charred timber. The scribes who composed them never saw the fields where bones lay whitening under the frost. To them, the provinces were numbers, categories, productive or rebellious, taxable or lost. Yet beneath those classifications were lives uncounted, women who walked through ruins collecting what little could be carried. A ring, a child's shoe, a fragment of bread hardened like stone. Among those women, a strange hierarchy emerged. The wives of slain warriors became living relics of defiance, feared by their neighbors, watched by Ottoman officials. Their very existence was an accusation. Many were forced into servitude within their own villages, tending the estates of the men who had killed their husbands. Some were remarried under compulsion, their consent replaced by decrees, stamped with the tugra, the imperial seal. Others disappeared altogether, recorded simply as relocated for order. That phrase, so neutral, so bureaucratic, concealed what it meant: removal to distant provinces where memory itself would dissolve. In the years following conquest, entire generations grew up without fathers, learning silence as a survival skill. The empire encouraged this quiet. It was safer than rebellion. Local clerics who dared to speak of the vanished risked imprisonment or exile. Instead, they wove their grief into parables. Stories circulated of unseen women haunting the edges of battlefields, gathering the souls of the dead. They were said to appear at dusk, veiled and barefoot, carrying bowls of ash. Some said they were angels, others that they were the wives of warriors, cursed to wander until justice returned. Whether myth or metaphor, the tales captured a truth: that loss had become the region's only inheritance. Travelers passing through these lands in the 16th century wrote of landscapes scarred by war but eerily disciplined. Roads were rebuilt, markets reopened, taxes collected. Yet beneath the apparent recovery lay a profound stillness, as though the people had learned to breathe quietly under the empire's gaze. Women worked the fields with lowered eyes, their bodies covered not by modesty but by fear. The old songs were forbidden. They hummed them anyway, under their breath, turning melody into defiance. In certain provinces, Ottoman officials instituted what they called restoration projects, programs to repopulate devastated areas with loyal subjects. Convoys of captives were resettled among foreign villages, forced to intermarry, to learn new languages, to erase the markers of origin. The state presented these policies as benevolence, but they functioned as dilution, a deliberate blurring of ethnic lines to prevent unity against the throne. The empire did not merely conquer territory, it conquered memory. For the women torn from their homes and delivered into distant households, the transformation was absolute. Their first months were spent in instruction, language, domestic duties, obedience. Each morning began with recitation, prayers in a tongue not their own, gestures of loyalty to masters they could not name. Punishment was swift for those who faltered. Yet within that rigid routine, fragments of identity persisted. One woman, whose baptismal name had been Anna before it was replaced by Aisha, was known to stitch tiny crosses into the hems of her garments, invisible to all but herself. Such acts of remembrance were microscopic rebellions, fragile as breath, but they endured. In the archives of certain provincial estates survive inventories of domestic assets, listing livestock, tools, and servants. Among these, the names of women appear without surnames: Maria, Eleni, Fatima, repeated hundreds of times until individuality collapses into repetition. Reading these lists today feels like descending into an ocean where all voices merge into one vast murmur. Historians debate whether these records exaggerate or understate the scale of captivity. The truth likely lies between, measured not in numbers, but in echoes. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the machinery of opulence spun without pause. The Sultan's court was a universe of ritual, where even sunlight was choreographed. Within the palace walls, new captives arrived weekly, washed, perfumed, and renamed. They entered the harem not as prisoners, but as servants of grace, a phrase that veiled their reality behind poetry. To the outside world, the harem symbolized beauty, refinement, mystery. To those within, it was a silence so deep it could be heard. The eunuchs who ruled these corridors enforced obedience with precision. They were men, stripped of lineage, guardians of those who would never again belong to any world beyond the palace. They spoke softly, moved soundlessly, and ensured that no message left the inner chambers. For the women, days dissolved into ceremony, lessons in dance, calligraphy, the recitation of verses praising the ruler. Yet among them were those who remembered battlefields, husbands, the scent of smoke. These memories did not fade. They merely sank deeper, resurfacing at night in dreams that woke them trembling. Occasionally, one of these women rose to prominence, favored by a prince or the Sultan himself. Chroniclers celebrated such ascents as tales of destiny, proof that fortune could elevate even the lowliest captive. They omitted what those women had endured to reach such favor. Power within the harem was built upon rivalry, suspicion, and the ever-present threat of replacement. A smile too confident, a whisper overheard could mean reassignment or death by quiet means. For every woman who rose to influence, 100 vanished into the labyrinth, their names lost to the bookkeeping of servitude. Beyond the palace, the empire's subjects watched these silent dramas with a mixture of fascination and dread. Gossip about the harem circulated in markets and coffee houses, carried by servants and guards. To the conquered, it became a mirror of their own captivity. The empire itself was a vast harem, gilded yet confined, ruled by unseen decrees. Some storytellers claim that the ghosts of dead warriors visited the palace at night, seeking the wives who had been taken from them. They were said to appear as shadows on the marble floors, kneeling before the locked doors of the women's quarters, unable to cross the threshold. The guards swore they heard whispers, half prayer, half curse, rising from the courtyards when the moon was full. Whether superstition or protest, these tales expressed a collective truth. The Ottoman order had turned suffering into architecture. Every dome and minaret, every scroll of decorative script concealed the labor and loss of the conquered. The beauty that astonished foreign visitors was, in part, an act of amnesia, the empire's way of transforming pain into grandeur. When European travelers wrote admiringly of the empire's splendor, they rarely noticed the quiet figures sweeping marble corridors, or the faint melody of a foreign lullaby sung by a woman whose children would never hear her voice again. As decades passed, the memory of specific wars blurred, but the pattern endured. Conquest followed conquest. Captives replaced captives. Generations of women lived and died within walls that called them home, but treated them as property. Their stories dissolved into lineage, grandmothers who had been born elsewhere, whose eyes held an unfamiliar sadness, whose prayers carried accents no one recognized. The empire's longevity depended on this constant forgetting. Its administrators understood that memory was more dangerous than rebellion. A sword could be broken, a story could not. And yet, fragments survived. In border villages, mothers told their daughters not fairy tales, but cautionary legends. Of the time when the empire came, when the bells stopped ringing, when the women were taken. They told these stories quietly, by firelight, always ending with the same words: "Remember what was lost, so it cannot happen again." The daughters nodded, though few truly believed memory could protect them. Still, the words endured, carried across centuries like embers hidden in ash. In the capital, meanwhile, reformers and scholars began to rewrite the empire's history, polishing its image for foreign eyes. The darker chapters were left unpublished, buried under new rhetoric of progress and enlightenment. But the palace walls remained, and within them the silence persisted. Visitors to the Topkapi of later centuries reported feeling a heaviness in the air, as though the building itself remembered what its chroniclers had forgotten. By the time the empire reached its zenith, stretching from the Danube to the Nile, the initial conquests were distant memory, almost legend. Yet the structure they had built, the hierarchy of domination, the habit of silence, remained untouched. In remote monasteries, monks continued to copy manuscripts that told of villages erased, women vanished, and faiths extinguished. They did so in secret, aware that the empire punished nostalgia as sedition. To remember too vividly was to risk the accusation of treason. Thus the conquered world learned to speak in symbols. A locked door meant defiance. A candle left burning through the night meant mourning. The empire tolerated these gestures, mistaking them for superstition, never realizing they were a language of resistance older than any decree. Through all this, the wives of defeated warriors, the first victims of the empire's most horrific practice, became both myth and memory. They appeared in songs, in dreams, in the hesitant pauses of speech when elders recalled the past. To some, they were martyrs, to others, warnings. Their individual faces vanished, but their collective presence haunted the empire's conscience. Even the sultans, for all their divinity, ruled beneath that gaze. Every throne in history casts a shadow, and in the Ottoman palaces, that shadow took the shape of women who once were free. The chronicles never mention their names, but their absence became its own kind of testimony. The empire's historians wrote of triumph, of order, of civilization, yet between the lines of those ornate manuscripts runs another story, the quiet persistence of the conquered, the unending echo of those who refuse to be entirely erased. It is said that in the final years of the old dynasty, when earthquakes shook Istanbul, some citizens believed it was not the shifting earth, but the restless souls beneath it, rising at last to demand remembrance. Whether the legend is true cannot be known. What endures is the certainty that every empire carries within its walls the ghosts of those it silenced. And though centuries may pass, the silence of the taken never truly fades. It merely waits for a listener. At the height of its power, Istanbul became the shimmering axis of two worlds, the bridge between faith and empire, paradise and prison. From a distance, its skyline gleamed with domes and minarets rising through the mist, as if heaven itself had ordained its permanence. Yet within its marble walls, beneath the blue tiles of Topkapi and the echo of the call to prayer, the same silence that once haunted conquered lands had taken a new form. It lived behind screens, in the breath of women whose laughter had been replaced by ritual. The harem was not fantasy, but machinery. To outsiders, it appeared a world of elegance and mystery. Yet within its order was the precision of war. Eunuchs patrolled the corridors with keys and discipline. Scribes maintained ledgers as meticulous as tax registers. Physicians measured purity and obedience as though cataloging a harvest. The women, ranked as novices, attendants, favorites, or consorts, moved like shadows scented with amber and fear. Every captive followed the same ritual of erasure. First came cleansing, the water washing away not only dirt, but the traces of a former life. Then the renaming. Eleni became Aisha, Anna became Layla, and entire histories vanished beneath syllables the empire could pronounce. The Ottoman logic was mercilessly simple. What could not be spoken would not exist. Memory, like rebellion, had to be silenced. Each dawn began with the sound of keys unlocking iron gates. Women stepped out with trays of bread or basins of water, their gestures measured, their faces blank. Those of higher rank could walk the gardens beneath cypress trees whose roots tangled with ancient graves. There they learned the art of invisibility, lowering their eyes, moving slowly, existing without sound. The palace taught that quiet was survival, yet silence never erased thought. Beneath obedience, stories moved like hidden rivers. Some women had been queens or poets' wives before the empire's armies crushed their kingdoms. They remembered. Their memories took the form of secret songs, coded embroidery, or verses carved into furniture, art disguised as devotion. These small rebellions preserved identity within a world that demanded its destruction. The black eunuchs, torn from Africa as boys and mutilated to serve, ruled the harem with quiet rigor. They were both prisoners and guards, men who understood captivity too deeply to pity it openly. At sunset, they checked locks, extinguished lamps, and enforced silence. Yet, history hints at mercy in their pauses, as though within the machinery of obedience, a flicker of shared sorrow survived. Within the women's ranks, hierarchy bred cruelty. A concubine who bore a prince might gain servants, jewels, and power, but also enemies. The harem fed on competition, just as the empire fed on conquest. For every woman who rose to prominence, hundreds more were lost to anonymity, their names fading from records before the ink dried. Some stories survived through rumor. A captive princess whose quiet gaze bent the sultan's will. A musician whose melodies turned grief into beauty. Their influence was real, but fragile, permitted only so long as it served the empire's myth. The moment they sought to rewrite it, they disappeared, poisoned, exiled, or erased from the chronicles altogether. Beyond the palace, the same system continued its endless cycle. Every new conquest brought new women to feed the empire's hunger. Caravans arrived at the city gates, bearing silks, spices, and captives. Traders spoke of them with chilling detachment. Circassian, refined features. Greek, musical talent. Albanian, strong constitution. It was the most civilized form of barbarism, human suffering disguised as commerce. Foreign ambassadors granted rare glimpses into the harem, returned to Europe both fascinated and disturbed. Some wrote admiringly of its discipline and beauty, others of its despair. One Venetian envoy described it as a city within a city, ruled by silence deeper than death. His words were censored upon return. The empire preferred admiration to truth. Yet even in their astonishment, outsiders could not see what the harem truly was. Not merely a prison of women, but a reflection of the empire itself, structured, ornate, absolute, and built upon subjugation. Inside the harem, power became paradox. The women, once trophies of conquest, learned to wield influence through subtler means, by whisper, by glance, by the manipulation of rumor. Over time, their quiet interventions reached the throne itself. Sultans, insulated by luxury, began to rule through intermediaries, viziers, eunuchs, and the women who knew how to speak without speaking. Historians would later call this age the Sultanate of Women, a phrase meant as scandal, but in truth a testament to resilience. What had begun as enslavement had become, for a few, the only possible form of governance they could claim. Still, for every woman who gained a voice, hundreds more remained invisible. Their lives were recorded only as numbers, entries in ledgers listing age, origin, temperament. Docile, proud, melancholy. The ink of bureaucracy became the empire's final cruelty, preserving not people but categories. Yet between those lines, history still breathes. Each mark hides a heartbeat, each statistic a name whispered only to memory. The paradox of the Ottoman world lay here. From its darkest cruelty emerged terrible beauty. The palaces themselves, glittering with tile and calligraphy, were built on the bones of the conquered. The poetry composed in captivity, the music born of despair, the architecture that masked the empire's wounds, all testified to its ability to turn pain into splendor. The Ottomans called this civilization. The victims called it survival. In time, even the sultans became captives of their own creation. Encircled by privilege, deafened by ceremony, they lived in golden isolation. The empire they commanded had become a mirror of the harem, magnificent, disciplined, and damned by its own silence. Centuries later, when reformers sought to modernize the state and abolish the old systems, they could not erase the ghosts. The harem was reduced, then emptied, but its legend endured. It had ceased to be a household and had become a symbol, the heart and conscience of the empire, both its pride and its condemnation. To dismiss it now as an aberration is to misunderstand its purpose. The harem was not deviation but design, the inevitable product of conquest and hierarchy. The wives of the defeated, the captives of distant lands, the concubines who bore princes, were all threads in one vast tapestry of domination. Their suffering formed the quiet foundation upon which the empire's serenity stood. And though the empire itself has fallen, its silence remains. The palaces still stand, polished for tourists, perfumed and bright, their history spoken only through marble and music. But if one listens past the rehearsed stories of guides and the hum of the crowd, something else can be heard, the faint echo of barefoot steps, the breath of women who once lived unseen within those walls. Their voices, once subdued by ritual, still linger in the air, patient and defiant. History, indifferent yet just, has begun to listen. In forgotten archives, in marginal notes and scattered songs, traces of those lives persist. A name here, a melody there, a prayer written in a trembling hand. Together they form a different chronicle, one whispered rather than proclaimed. The story of endurance, of quiet resistance, of dignity preserved in silence. The harem, that golden prison, may have bound them in ritual and obedience, but within its silence lived voices that never ceased. They spoke of pain, of memory, of the cost of empire. They speak still, through the centuries, reminding us that beneath every civilization's splendor lies an unspoken ledger, the lives that paid for its light. And if one listens long enough, beyond the marble and the myths, one might still hear them. The wives of the defeated, the nameless captives, the women who bore the weight of an empire that mistook silence for peace. When the empire finally began to fade, it did so not with thunder, but with a long, weary sigh. The palaces still gleamed under the Anatolian sun. The muezzin still called the faithful to prayer. Yet beneath the mosaics and marble, the foundation had already begun to crack. The grandeur that had once awed the world now felt hollow, a memory replaying itself for no one's benefit. The sultans sat behind silken curtains, insulated from decay, surrounded by the ghosts of their own magnificence. The harem, too, aged with them, a dim echo of its former power, its corridors heavy with dust and memory, rather than perfume and music. For centuries, the empire had survived through silence. But silence, like empire, erodes from within. By the dawn of the 19th century, change had come knocking on the palace gates. Beyond Istanbul, Revolutions and ideas of liberty spread across Europe, carried by newspapers, ships, and whispers. Yet the Ottoman court clung to ritual, as if time itself bowed to the will of its traditions. Inside the gilded halls, foreign ambassadors noticed something new. Women reading French, learning to write poetry, listening for the faint promise of freedom in the conversations of servants and sailors. The most voiceless inhabitants of the empire had begun, quietly, to imagine speech. Many of these women were not captives from conquest, but the daughters of those who had been. They had known no battlefields, only velvet corridors and painted ceilings. Yet they felt the same confinement. They understood that the silks which wrapped them were also chains. Some began to write, poems smuggled in the margins of prayer books, letters hidden behind tiles, small rebellions of ink and thought. Most were punished, but a few seeds took root. The realization that silence was no longer protection. It was submission. Outside the palace, the empire trembled. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, nations once crushed beneath the Ottoman banner, rose in rebellion, singing songs their ancestors had whispered under foreign rule. These uprisings were not only political, they were acts of remembrance. The grief of generations, the wives, the mothers, the daughters taken by force, had ripened into rebellion. Empires, it seemed, do not die when their armies lose. They die when their victims remember. Still, the bureaucrats of Istanbul copied decrees as they always had. Their pens scratched on parchment, abolishing slavery, promising reform, declaring renewal. Yet they must have felt the tremor in their own handwriting, knowing that each word condemned the system that had given them power. The empire's cruel genius, the conversion of human suffering into order, was no longer sustainable in a world that had begun to measure progress by its conscience. Foreign painters and writers flooded the capital, fascinated by the decaying splendor. The Ottomans, anxious to control the narrative, commissioned portraits of serene, educated women, the modern faces of the harem. Yet art cannot hide truth for long. The more they polished their image, the clearer the cracks became. Western observers described the palace not as paradise, but as mausoleum, a kingdom embalmed while still breathing. Inside those fading chambers, time itself had grown strange. Some women had served 3 sultans. They could remember when the palace had been alive with laughter and rivalry, when new captives arrived weekly, when power still flowed through whispers. Now the marble floors stayed cool and silent. The eunuchs grew old and stooped. The fountains rarely ran. To visitors, the place felt less like a residence than a relic, its beauty untouched, its purpose long dead. One chronicler who entered the harem in its final years described women sitting by high windows, staring at the Bosporus they would never cross. Their silence, he wrote, was heavier than chains. Yet, in that silence, he sensed something indestructible: endurance. These women, once nameless, had outlived the empire that enslaved them. Their captivity had made them witnesses to all it wished to forget. When the reforms finally reached the palace, a quiet decree was issued. Certain women were released from service. There was no ceremony, no apology. Some returned to faraway lands they barely remembered. Others melted into the city, their pasts hidden beneath plain veils. They carried with them stories too dangerous to tell, and too painful to keep. A few wrote them down in secret, in languages they had to relearn. Others passed them orally, as warnings and prayers. None sought revenge. They had learned what their rulers never did, that vengeance is only another form of empire. What they wanted was remembrance. Over the next decades, the rooms of the harem emptied one by one. Furniture was sold, manuscripts lost, gardens left to the wind. When the palace was finally opened to the public, it was presented as art, not confession. Guides spoke of tilework, geometry, and architecture, but never of the women who had once filled those rooms with breath and sorrow. History once again had been made comfortable. Yet the past is never fully buried. Visitors to Topkapi whispered of strange sensations, the sound of silk brushing against stone, the faint scent of jasmine where no flowers grew, a sudden chill near the locked doors of the inner chambers. The caretakers laughed, but the stories endured. It was said the walls themselves remembered, the echo of prayers whispered in captivity, footsteps pacing through centuries of longing. Outside those walls, the empire finally fractured into nations. Some glorified their Ottoman past, others cursed it. But in every retelling, the women remained peripheral, too human to celebrate, too vital to erase. Their suffering drifted between myth and memory, both burden and inheritance. Still, traces of them persist. In archives, in forgotten diaries, in a lock of hair pressed between pages. Sometimes a name appears, then disappears beneath a single word. Gone. It is a small word, yet it carries the weight of an empire. Modern historians debate their place. Were they victims or survivors who quietly shaped history? The truth, perhaps, lies in between. They were not martyrs or revolutionaries. They were human. Their endurance was not heroic but necessary. And necessity, history teaches, is the first form of rebellion. When the 20th century dawned, the Ottoman world finally collapsed under its own ghosts. Republics rose where sultans had ruled, and the palaces became museums of marble and myth. The new rulers spoke of progress and equality, but preferred to look away from the shadows of the women who had once been the empire's conscience. Once again, they were silenced, this time by modernity's pride. And yet, forgetting is never complete. Across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Middle East, old songs about the taken wives survived, sung not as sorrow, but as warning. They told of beauty turned into weapon, silence into shield. In those verses, the women were neither saints nor sinners, but reminders that history belongs not only to those who conquer, but to those who endure. Today, scholars tracing Ottoman bloodlines find the empire's unintended legacy. Families in Greece, Albania, and Turkey, bound by ancestry that crosses borders and faiths. What had begun as an act of domination became, across centuries, a quiet reconciliation. The bloodlines meant to erase identity became bridges between cultures. From conquest, connection. From suffering, a strange kind of unity. And so, as dusk falls over the Bosporus, where the palace walls turn to shadow and the sea swallows the last light, it is impossible not to feel that the empire has never entirely gone. It lives on in what cannot be named, in the faces of descendants, in nameless songs, in the soft rhythm of footsteps echoing through Topkapi's halls. Those steps are not the echo of empire, but of the women who survived it, the wives of the defeated, the captives who became mothers, the nameless authors of a history the world is still learning how to hear. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.